She stood at the altar in a borrowed dress, trembling, not from cold, but from rage. At 19, Fama Bennett was being sold like livestock to pay her father's debts. The groom was a stranger, a dirt-poor farmer with calloused hands and eyes that revealed nothing. The preacher asked if she took this man. She wanted to scream no, but her father's warning echoed in her mind. Refuse, and her younger sisters would take her place. So she whispered I do and sealed her fate. That night, in his remote cabin, he did something she never expected, something that would change everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened that night, you need to know how Fama ended up at that altar in the first place. 2 weeks earlier, she'd been living in the small town of Millbrook, working her fingers raw as a seamstress. Every penny she earned went toward feeding her 3 younger sisters. Emma was 16, sweet and gentle. Marie was 14, sharp-tongued and clever. Little Sarah was only 12, still believing the world could be kind. Their mother had died giving birth to Sarah, and their father, Robert Bennett, had spent the years since drowning his grief in whiskey and card games. Fama had raised those girls herself. She'd been only 7 when her mother passed, but she learned fast how to cook with almost nothing, how to mend clothes until they were more patched than fabric, how to make her sisters laugh even when their bellies were empty. She'd promised her dying mother she'd keep them safe, and for 12 years, she'd kept that promise. But promises don't pay debts, and her father's gambling had finally caught up with them all. Victor Hartwell owned half the county. He was the kind of man who smiled while he ruined you. Wealthy, powerful, and cruel in ways that never left bruises you could see. When he showed up at their small house that Tuesday morning, Fama had been hanging laundry in the yard. She'd heard his expensive boots on the porch boards, heard her father's voice go high and desperate inside. She crept to the window and listened to every word. Her father owed $500, a fortune, money they'd never have. Hartwell had given him 6 months to pay. That time was up. I don't have it, her father had said, and Fama heard the tremor in his voice. Please, Victor, give me more time. But Hartwell wasn't a man who gave second chances. He gave choices, and they were always poisoned. Here's what we'll do, Robert. Your eldest daughter will marry a man of my choosing. Do this, and your debt is forgiven. Your family keeps this house. Your daughters keep their roof. Refuse, and I'll take the middle girl instead. You have until tomorrow to decide. Fama's blood had gone cold. She'd looked across the yard at her sisters. Emma was teaching Sarah how to braid flowers in her hair. Marie was reading aloud from a book, her voice bright with hope. They had no idea their world was ending. That night, Fama couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed she shared with her sisters and listened to them breathe. She thought about running, about taking them all and disappearing into the wilderness. But where would they go? How would they survive? She was 19 with no money, no connections, nothing but the calluses on her hands and the desperate love in her heart. The next morning, a wagon rolled into town. Fama was sweeping the porch when she saw him for the first time. James Whitmore. He was tall, maybe 28, with dark hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn thin in places. His hands gripped the reins of an old horse, and his eyes swept over the town like he was looking for something he'd lost. Hartwell met him in the street. Fama watched from a distance as they talked. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw money change hands, saw Hartwell point toward her father's house, saw James's jaw tighten like he was bracing for a blow, and they were walking toward her. Hartwell's smile was wide and satisfied. James's expression was unreadable as stone. "This is your future husband," Hartwell announced, like he was introducing her to a new horse. "James Whitmore, meet Fama Bennett. You'll be married by week's end." Fama had stared at this stranger, searching his face for some hint of what kind of man he was. Would he beat her, use her, break her spirit like her father had tried to break their mother's? But James just looked at her with those tired eyes and said, "I have a cabin 15 miles north. Modest but sturdy. Nothing more. No greeting, no kindness, just facts delivered like he was reading from a ledger. The week passed in a blur of dread. Fama tried to prepare her sisters, but how do you explain that you're being sold? Emma cried herself sick. Marie raged and threatened to run away with Fama. Little Sarah just held Fama's hand and whispered, "Will you come back to visit?" The question broke something in Fama's chest. She didn't know the answer. She didn't know anything except that she was about to become the property of a man she'd never met, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. The wedding day arrived cold and gray. The church was nearly empty. A few neighbors came out of morbid curiosity. Her father stood in the back, too drunk and ashamed to meet her eyes. Hartwell sat in the front pew, watching everything with that snake smile. Her sisters were the only ones who cried. James arrived in a suit that had seen better days. He stood at the altar and waited, his face giving away nothing. When Fama walked down that aisle in a dress borrowed from the preacher's wife, she felt like she was walking to her execution. The ceremony was mercifully short. The preacher rushed through the words like he wanted it over with as much as she did. "Do you, Fama Bennett, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She'd opened her mouth to refuse, to damn the consequences and run. But then she saw little Sarah's face in the pews, terrified and trusting, and she knew she couldn't. "I do," she whispered, and the words tasted like ash. James's vows were steady, emotionless, a business transaction being finalized. When he slipped the ring on her finger, it was too large. It hung loose, ready to fall off at any moment, just like her hope. As they were signing the papers, Fama heard something that made her blood freeze. Hartwell had pulled James aside, just a few feet away. His voice was low, but Fama had always had sharp ears. 6 months, Hartwell murmured. "That's all you need to keep her. Then the deed transfers to you free and clear. Just make sure she doesn't find out about our arrangement." James said nothing, but Fama saw his shoulders tense. There was something else happening here. Some deal she wasn't part of. Some game being played with her life as the stakes. The wagon ride to James's cabin was 15 miles of silence. Fama sat as far from him as the narrow bench allowed. The road wound through forest and over hills, taking them farther from everything she'd ever known. She tried not to think about what was coming, about the wedding night, about what rights he now had over her body. She'd heard the women in town talk in whispers about what husbands expected, what they took whether you were willing or not. Her hands shook in her lap, and she hid them under her shawl so he wouldn't see her fear. James noticed anyway. Without looking at her, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a thick wool blanket. "Here," he said quietly. "You're shaking." It wasn't a question or a command, just an observation and an offering. Fama took the blanket, too surprised to refuse. It smelled like wood smoke and pine. She wrapped it around her shoulders and felt a tiny bit warmer, though her fear didn't ease. Why would he care if she was cold? What kind of man bought a bride and then worried about her comfort? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. The cabin appeared as the sun began to set. It was small but well built, with smoke rising from the chimney. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a small garden plot. The kind of place that could be a home if the people inside it were happy. But Fama wasn't happy. She was terrified. James helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal. He didn't try to hold her hand or pull her close. He just gestured toward the door and said, "It's warmer inside." The cabin's interior was simple. One large room with a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen area. A bed in the corner, made up with clean sheets. The loft above held more storage. Everything was neat and organized, almost obsessively so. James had prepared for her arrival. There was a fire burning, food on the table, a place set for 2. He'd been expecting her, planning for this moment. Fama's stomach churned. Was this kindness or just preparation for what he intended to do? They ate in silence. Fama couldn't taste the food. Her mouth was too dry, her throat too tight. Every few minutes, she glanced at the bed in the corner, and her heart hammered faster. James didn't eat much either. He kept his eyes on his plate, his jaw working like he was chewing more than just food. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. Night fell completely, and there was nowhere left to hide from what came next. Finally, James pushed back from the table and stood. Fama's whole body went rigid. This was it. This was the moment. She braced herself, trying to remember to breathe, try not to cry. But James didn't move toward her. He stood by the fire, his back to her, shoulders tight with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like the words were being dragged out of him against his will. "There's something you need to understand about this marriage," he said, and Fama's world held its breath, waiting for everything to change. James turned to face her, and in the firelight, Fama could see something in his expression she hadn't expected. It wasn't cruelty or hunger. It was exhaustion mixed with something that looked almost like shame. "I won't touch you," he said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever. Unless you wish it." The words hung in the air between them like something impossible. Fama stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What did you say?" she whispered. James's jaw tightened. "This marriage," he continued, keeping his distance by the fire. "It's a business arrangement. Nothing more. I need a wife on paper for 6 months. That's all. You can have the bed. I'll sleep in the loft. After the 6 months are up, you're free to leave. I'll give you money to start over wherever you want." Fama's mind reeled. This had to be a trick. Some cruel game before he showed his true nature. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Why would you agree to marry a complete stranger if you don't want a real wife?" James looked away, his hands clenching at his sides. "Victor Hartwell holds the deed to this land. It's been in my family for 3 generations. He bought up my debts after my wife died, added terms I couldn't possibly meet. Then he gave me an ultimatum: marry within 6 months or lose everything. When the 6 months are up, the deed transfers to me free and clear. That's the deal. But why me?" Fama pressed. "There must be dozens of women who would have married you willingly. Why did Hartwell force you to marry someone whose father owed him money?" James's expression darkened. "I don't know. That's what worries me. Hartwell doesn't do anything without a reason. When he told me he'd found the perfect bride, someone who would be grateful enough to stay quiet and play her part, I knew something else was going on. But I was desperate. This land is all I have left of them." He gestured vaguely, and Fama understood he meant his dead wife and child. "I'm just part of some contract," she said bitterly. "A piece of property being traded between men." James met her eyes then, and she saw genuine regret there. "I know what it's like to have no choice," he said quietly. "I'm sorry you were forced into this, but I'm offering you what freedom I can. 6 months of safety, a roof over your head, food, and then enough money to go wherever you want and start fresh. You don't owe me anything beyond appearing as my wife when necessary. No one needs to know the truth." Fama wanted to scream at him, to rage against the injustice of it all. But exhaustion was crashing over her like a wave. She'd been terrified for weeks. She'd barely slept, and now this stranger was offering her something she'd never expected. Safety, even if it was temporary and strange. "What's the catch?" she asked, because there was always a catch. "No catch," James said. "Just keep up appearances in town. Let people believe we're married. After 6 months, you can tell everyone you're leaving me if you want. Blame me. I don't care. You'll have money and freedom." Fama studied his face, looking for the lie. But all she saw was a tired man who'd lost everything and was clinging to the last piece of it. "Fine," she said finally. 6 months. But if you touch me, if you break your word, I'll find a way to make you regret it." James nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He gestured to the bed. "It's yours. There are extra blankets in the chest if you need them. I'll be up in the loft if you need anything." He turned and climbed the ladder without another word, leaving Fama alone by the fire. She stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Her wedding night, and she was sleeping alone. Her new husband was a widower using her to keep his land. And somewhere in all of this, Victor Hartwell was pulling strings for reasons she couldn't understand. Finally, too tired to think anymore, she went to the bed and lay down fully clothed. She didn't sleep for hours. She just stared at the ceiling, listening to James shift restlessly in the loft above, and wondered what kind of strange life she just stepped into. Morning came gray and cold. Fama woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where she was. Then all came rushing back. The wedding, the cabin, James's strange promise. She sat up and saw that he was already gone. The fire had been rebuilt. There was fresh water in the basin, a clean towel laid out. He'd been moving around while she slept, and she hadn't heard a thing. For some reason, that made her uneasy. She got up and explored the cabin properly in the daylight. It was simple but well-maintained. Everything had its place. The dishes were clean. The floors were swept. There were books on a shelf, actual books, which surprised her. Most farmers she knew couldn't read beyond their own names. She was examining the titles when something on the mantel caught her eye. A photograph in a simple wooden frame. Fama picked it up carefully. The image showed James, younger and smiling in a way she couldn't imagine him doing now. Next to him stood a beautiful woman with kind eyes and dark hair. Between them was a small boy, maybe 4 years old, grinning at the camera. They looked happy. They looked like a real family. Fama turned the photograph over. On the back, someone had written in careful script, Sarah, 1889. Daniel, 1889. Both names were crossed out with a single dark line. Fama's throat tightened. He'd lost them both the same year. A wife and child. No wonder his eyes looked so empty. She set the photograph back carefully, exactly as she'd found it. The door opened, and James came in carrying firewood. He stopped when he saw her by the mantel, his gaze flicking to the photograph. "I'm sorry," Fama said quietly. "I wasn't snooping. I just saw it." James set down the wood, his movements stiff. "Fever," he said, his voice flat. 2 years ago. Sarah got sick first. Daniel a week later. Both gone within days of each other. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could do. Fama didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small for a loss like that. So she just nodded, and they stood there in awkward silence until James cleared his throat. "I'll show you where everything is," he said. "If you're staying 6 months, you should know how things work around here." He wasn't unkind about it, just practical. He showed her the root cellar, the chicken coop, where he kept the tools. He explained his routines, when he did chores, when he went to town for supplies. "You don't have to do any of this," he added. "I'm not expecting you to work." But Fama had been working since she was 7 years old. The idea of sitting idle felt wrong. "I can cook," she offered, "and mend things. I'm a good seamstress." James looked surprised, like he hadn't expected her to offer anything. "You don't have to," he repeated. "I know," Fama said, "but I'll go crazy just sitting around. And if I'm going to be here 6 months, I might as well make myself useful." James considered this, then nodded slowly. "There's a spare room in the barn. If you want to set up your sewing there, you're welcome to it. I could bring some boards and make you a proper work table." It was a small kindness, but it was something. Maybe this arrangement wouldn't be entirely unbearable. The days settled into a strange routine. Fama cooked meals she didn't have to cook. James did chores he'd been doing alone for years. They moved around each other carefully, like two strangers sharing a stage. Conversation was minimal and practical. "Pass the salt. I'm going to town tomorrow. There's a storm coming." But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of their mutual wariness began to soften. Fama started to notice small things. The way James always made sure there was fresh water in the morning. How he never came inside without knocking first, even though it was his own house. The way he'd leave wildflowers on the table sometimes, picked from the meadow, with no explanation or expectation of thanks. And James noticed things too. How Fama always saved the best portions of food for him. The way she'd mended his shirts without being asked. Her stitches small and perfect. How she hummed while she worked. Old songs that made the cabin feel less empty. Neither of them spoke about these observations. They just continued their careful dance of polite strangers. Fama wrote letters to her sisters every week. She told them she was safe, that James was kind, that they shouldn't worry. She didn't tell them about the contract or the 6-month limit. She didn't tell them she slept alone every night while her husband stayed in the loft. James would take the letters to town and post them without ever asking what she'd written. The replies came back full of her sister's chatter and worry. Emma said their father was drinking more. Marie reported that Hartwell had been by the house twice, asking questions about Fama. Little Sarah just wrote that she missed her and wanted a visit. The letters about Hartwell made Fama uneasy, but she didn't know what to make of them. James seemed troubled too when she mentioned it. "He's checking on his investment," James said darkly, "making sure we're holding up our end." The thought made Fama's skin crawl. 3 weeks into the marriage, they made their first trip to town together. James needed supplies, and Fama wanted to see her sisters, even briefly. The ride into Millbrook was quiet. When they arrived, people stared. Women whispered behind their hands. Men nodded to James, but looked at Fama with something like pity. At the general store, the shopkeeper served 3 other customers before acknowledging Fama, even though she'd been there first. One of the women, Mrs. Patterson, who'd known Fama since she was a child, looked right through her like she didn't exist. When the shopkeeper finally took her order, he was curt and dismissive. "Hartwell's charity case," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Thought you'd be grateful for what you got." Fama's face burned with humiliation. But before she could respond, James was there. His hand came down on the counter with enough force to make the shopkeeper jump. "My wife," James said, his voice quiet but dangerous, "is owed the same respect as anyone else in this store. You'll serve her promptly and courteously, or you'll lose my business, and I'll make sure every farmer within 20 miles knows why." The shopkeeper's face went pale. "Yes, sir, Mr. Whitmore. Of course. My apologies, ma'am." Outside, Fama was shaking. She hadn't expected James to defend her. They barely knew each other. Their marriage was a business arrangement, but he'd stood up for her anyway. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly as they loaded supplies into the wagon. "Yes, I did," James replied. "You're my wife. Even if it's only on paper, that means something. People will treat you with respect, or they'll answer to me." It was the first time he'd called her his wife with any kind of conviction, and something in Fama's chest loosened just a little. Maybe this strange arrangement wouldn't be completely lonely after all. That night, Fama couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the way James had defended her, about the photograph of his lost family, about the careful distance he maintained, always respectful, never presuming. She was lying in the dark when she heard it. A sound from the loft above. James was having a nightmare. She could hear him breathing hard, muttering words she couldn't make out. Then he cried out, a sound of pure anguish. "Sarah, Daniel, no, please." He woke himself up, and Fama heard him gasping, trying to muffle the sound. The loft went quiet except for his ragged breathing. Fama lay there in the darkness, her heart aching for this broken man she barely knew. "I'm sorry you're hurting," she said softly into the quiet. She didn't know if he'd hear her or if he'd respond. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from the loft above, a single word, rough and raw and grateful. "Thank you." It wasn't much, just 2 words exchanged in the darkness. But it felt like something had shifted between them. Some wall had developed its first crack. Fama closed her eyes and finally slept. And for the first time since her wedding day, she didn't feel quite so alone. Spring came sudden and violent. One morning, Fama woke to sunshine and birdsong, and by afternoon the sky had turned black. The wind hit like a fist, tearing at the barn roof and sending the animals into a panic. James was already outside when Fama heard the first crash. She didn't think. She just ran. The barn door was flapping wild on its hinges. Inside, the horses were screaming, and she could see a section of roof peeling back like paper. James was climbing a ladder, trying to secure it with one hand while the wind tried to rip him off. Fama grabbed tools and climbed up after him. "Are you crazy?" James shouted over the roar of the storm. "Get back inside." "Not a chance," she yelled back. "Hold that corner." They worked together in the driving rain, hammering boards, securing ropes, fighting the wind for every inch. By the time they got the animals calmed and the worst of the damage patched, they were both soaked through and shaking. They collapsed in the hay, too exhausted to move. Then James started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh, deep and genuine. Fama found herself laughing too, half from relief and half from the sheer madness of it all. "You're insane," James said, grinning at her in a way she'd never seen before. "Running out into a storm like that. You could have been hurt." "So could you," Fama shot back. "There are animals." Someone had to help. She'd said out without thinking, and the word hung between them. James's smile softened into something else, something that made Fama's breath catch. He looked at her like he was really seeing her for the first time, not as an obligation or a business arrangement, but as a person, as someone who mattered. The moment stretched, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Then James cleared his throat and looked away. "We should get inside. You're shivering." But as they walked back to the cabin, Fama felt something had changed between them. That night, as she dried her hair by the fire, she found herself asking the question that had been nagging at her for weeks. Why did Hartwell really choose me for this arrangement? What does he get out of pairing us specifically? James was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I've been wondering the same thing. After Sarah died, I fell behind on the mortgage. Hartwell bought up my debt and added terms that were impossible to meet. Then he offered this solution, said he had the perfect bride, someone who would be grateful enough to stay quiet and not ask questions. When I saw you at that altar looking terrified, I knew he'd trapped us both. But why go to all that trouble? There are easier ways to take someone's land." "Maybe it's not just about the land," Fama said slowly. "Maybe there's something on this property he wants. Something specific." James's expression changed. The next morning, while he was working the far fields, Fama decided to explore the property boundaries. She'd been here almost 3 months, but had never ventured beyond the immediate area around the cabin. She followed the creek upstream, past the meadow, into the hills. That's when she saw them. Survey stakes. New ones, driven into the ground in a careful line. Each one marked with Hartwell's company name. Her heart pounding, Fama followed the stakes. They led her up a rocky slope to a place where the creek emerged from the hillside. But this wasn't just a creek source. It was a spring, a massive natural spring, crystal clear water bubbling up from deep underground. Even in the drought that had plagued the valley for 2 years, this spring flowed strong and pure. Fama's breath caught. Water rights. That's what this was about. Water was more valuable than gold in a drought. With this spring, someone could control irrigation for the entire valley. Every farmer would have to pay for access. It would be worth a fortune. She ran back to the cabin and found James. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly. She took him to the spring and showed him the survey stakes. James's face went pale as he understood. "That's why he needed me married," James said slowly. "Water rights laws say a married man can't sell without his wife's consent. But if I die or disappear, the land reverts to Hartwell as the debt holder. And you, as a forced bride with no legal standing, would have no power to stop him." Fama felt cold despite the warm spring air. The 6-month deadline. What happens when it's up? James met her eyes, and she saw fear there. "I don't know, but I don't think Hartwell plans to let either of us walk away from this." Then there was something else, something that made James's hands shake as he said it. "Sarah and Daniel. They died of fever 2 years ago, right after Hartwell started pressuring me to sell. The doctor who treated them was Hartwell's personal physician." Fama's stomach dropped. "You think he killed them?" James's voice was hollow. "I never questioned it. I was so destroyed by grief, I couldn't think straight. But now, knowing what he's willing to do, how he orchestrated all of this. God, what if they didn't die of fever? What if he murdered my family to get this land? And when that didn't work, he came up with this plan?" The implications were staggering. If Hartwell had killed once, he'd kill again. They stood by the spring, the water that was worth murdering for, and realized they were both marked for death. "We have to do something," Fama said. "We can't just wait for him to make his move." But what could they do? Hartwell owned the sheriff, the judge, half the county. They were two people with no power and no proof, standing between a wealthy man and a fortune. 3 months had passed since Fama stood at that altar. 3 months since James promised not to touch her. But somewhere along the way, between shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire, something had shifted. They talked now, really talked, about books and dreams and the people they used to be before grief and desperation had hollowed them out. Fama told them about raising her sisters, about her mother's death, about the weight of being responsible for everyone. James shared memories of Sarah without flinching. "She would have liked you," he said one night. "She always said I needed someone who wouldn't let me brood." The touches came accidentally at first. Hands brushing as they passed dishes. Shoulders bumping as they worked side by side in the garden. But lately, the touches lingered. James would steady her elbow when she climbed down from the wagon. Fama would rest her hand on his shoulder when she poured his coffee. Neither of them spoke about it, but the air between them had become charged with something neither could ignore. Then one evening, James was repairing a chair, and Fama brought him water. Their fingers touched on the cup, and neither pulled away. "I need to tell you something," Fama said quietly. "This arrangement, these 6 months, I don't want it to end." James set down the cup carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to stay. Not because of the contract or Hartwell or any of it. Because of you." James stood, and she could see the conflict on his face. "The contract says you're free in 3 more months. You deserve that freedom. What if I'm choosing this? Choosing you?" James's voice was rough. "Ask me again after 6 months. When you're truly free to choose. When this isn't about survival or safety, but about what you really want." Fama felt frustration rise in her chest, but she understood. He was protecting her, giving her the choice he'd never had. But then everything accelerated. A letter came from Emma. Hartwell had been to their house again, asking pointed questions. Is Fama happy? Does James treat her well? Does the marriage seem real? He seemed very interested in whether we're truly married, Emma wrote. It felt wrong, like he's looking for something. James read the letter, his jaw tight. He's checking for fraud. If he can prove the marriage isn't real, there must be some clause that lets him take the land anyway. They pulled out the contract James had signed, reading through the fine print they'd both ignored before. And there it was, buried in legal language. If the marriage is proven fraudulent or unconsummated, the bride's family forfeits all protections previously granted. Original debts will be reinstated with triple interest. Fama felt the blood drain from her face. My sisters. If Hartwell proves we haven't been living as man and wife, he can go after them. The debt was $500. Triple, that would be $1,500. Her father would never pay it. Hartwell would take the house, maybe take her sisters as payment. We're trapped, she whispered. No matter what we do, he wins. James's hands clenched into fists. No, we make this marriage real, legally unbreakable. Then we find proof of what he's done, and we take him down. That night, Fama descended from the loft where she'd been sleeping. James was sitting at the table, staring at the contract like he could burn it with his eyes. She stood before him, her decision made. I consent, she said simply, to making this marriage real. Not for Hartwell, not for the contract, for us. James stood slowly. Are you certain? Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm certain, Fama said. I choose you, James Whitmore. I choose this life we've been building. I choose us. He crossed to her in 2 strides and cupped her face in his calloused hands. I'm falling in love with you, he said, his voice breaking. This isn't strategy or survival. It's real. I know, Fama whispered. I'm falling too. Their first real kiss was gentle, then desperate, then healing. Years of loneliness melting between them. Morning came with new resolve. They were no longer two strangers bound by contract. They were partners, united against a common enemy. James held Fama close in the early light and said, "We need proof. Real evidence that will stand up even against Hartwell's money and influence." They started with the town doctor. Old Dr. Morrison had always seemed uncomfortable when Sarah and Daniel's deaths were mentioned. James and Fama found him at his office, and after an hour of careful conversation, his guilt finally broke through. "Those symptoms," he said, his hands shaking. "I've thought about it 1,000 times. It wasn't fever. It could have been poison. Arsenic maybe, but Hartwell paid me to sign the death certificates without questions. He said it would be better for everyone if there was no investigation. Paid me $500 to keep quiet. Will you testify to that?" Fama asked. The old man looked terrified, but he nodded slowly. "If it means stopping him from hurting anyone else, yes." They had their first piece of evidence. Next was the land office. The clerk there, a thin, nervous man named Peters, hated Hartwell. When James explained what they were looking for, Peters pulled out records going back 10 years. "Look at this pattern," Peters said, spreading documents across his desk. "Every 2 years, someone with valuable water rights dies or disappears. Their land goes to Hartwell. There have been at least 6 cases. 6 families destroyed." Fama had an idea. "What about the widows? If there are other women like me forced into marriages, maybe they'll talk." They found 3 women over the next week. Each had a similar story. Married to men with valuable property. Husbands dead within a year under suspicious circumstances. All of them too frightened to speak up before. But together, they found courage. "We can take this to the territorial marshal," James said. "Bypass the local law that Hartwell controls." But they were running out of time. 1 week before the 6-month deadline, an invitation arrived. "Victor Hartwell requests the pleasure of your company for dinner at his estate." It was written in elegant script on expensive paper. "It's a trap," Fama said immediately. "Probably," James agreed. "But we need to know his next move." We go, but we're careful. The dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as Fama expected. Hartwell's mansion was obscene in its wealth. Crystal chandeliers, imported rugs, servants in livery. The other guests were all men in Hartwell's pocket. The judge who'd looked the other way. The sheriff who never investigated. The land commissioner who approved every shady deal. During dinner, Hartwell made toast after toast. To profitable partnerships. To understanding one's place. To knowing when to accept generous offers. Every word was a veiled threat. After the meal, he maneuvered James into his study. Fama was left in the parlor with the other guests. That's when a young woman, one of Hartwell's maids, whispered urgently to her, "You need to leave. Tonight. He's planned something terrible. I've seen the ledgers. All the people he's killed to get their land. You and your husband are next on the list." Fama's blood went cold, but she kept her composure. "Where are the ledgers?" The maid shook her head. "He keeps them locked up. But I'm telling you, Run." In the study, Hartwell was making his final offer to James. "The 6 months are almost up. Sign over the water rights now, and I'll give you $10,000. You could take that girl and start over somewhere else. No one needs to get hurt. And if I refuse," James asked quietly. "Then accidents happen," Hartwell said with a cold smile. "Houses catch fire. People disappear. It would be a shame if something happened to those pretty little sisters of Fama's." James wanted to lunge across the desk and strangle him, but he controlled himself. "I need time to think about it." "You have 3 days," Hartwell said. "Then I come to collect one way or another." The ride home was tense and silent. When they reached the cabin, James finally spoke. "We're out of time. We have to act now." But they were too late. As they approached the cabin, they saw it. The door was hanging open. Inside, everything had been ransacked. All their carefully gathered evidence was gone. Then men stepped out of the shadows. 4 of them, armed and rough-looking. James pushed Fama behind him, but there were too many. They swarmed him, fists and boots flying. Fama screamed and tried to help, but one of them grabbed her. Run, James shouted through bloody lips. Take the backup evidence and run. Fama had hidden a copy of everything in the barn. She twisted free and sprinted into the darkness. Fama crouched in the forest, clutching the evidence packet to her chest. She could hear James being dragged away, hear Hartwell's voice smooth and victorious. You should have taken the money, James. Now you'll disappear like the others, and your widow will be so devastated she'll meet with an unfortunate accident shortly after. Then that spring will finally be mine. Every instinct screamed at Fama to run, to save herself, but she thought about her sisters, about James defending her in that store, about the life they'd started building together, about the quiet man who'd given her freedom when he could have taken everything. She rode hard to Millbrook, straight to the church where she'd been married against her will. The preacher was locking up for the night when she burst through the doors. Ring the bells, she demanded. Call the town. Now. The preacher stared at her disheveled appearance, the wild look in her eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, it's nearly midnight. Ring the bells, or I'll do it myself, Fama said. You married me to a stranger knowing I was being sold like property. You stood there and blessed a transaction. Do you want more blood on your hands? Something in her voice made him move. The church bells rang out across the sleeping town, their urgent clamor pulling people from their beds. Within 30 minutes, a crowd had gathered in confusion. Fama stood on the church steps, terrified but determined. She pulled out the evidence and began to read. Names and dates, properties and deaths, a decade of murder and theft, all documented. Victor Hartwell has been killing people for their land, she said, her voice carrying across the square. My husband's first wife and child, at least 6 others. And tonight he's taken James to kill him for a spring worth thousands. The crowd murmured. Some looked skeptical. Hartwell arrived with the sheriff, all righteous indignation. This woman is hysterical, he announced, making wild accusations because her marriage failed. She's lying. Then explain the survey stakes on my husband's land, Fama shot back. Explain why you needed me specifically for this marriage. Explain the pattern of deaths. The old doctor stepped forward from the crowd. She's telling the truth. I signed false death certificates. Hartwell paid me to cover up murders. The 3 widows came forward next, each sharing their stories. The crowd's mood began to shift. Where's James Whitmore? Someone shouted. Hartwell's composure cracked slightly. He left, abandoned his wife. He's at your estate, Fama said, along with evidence you stole tonight. The crowd surged forward, angry now. The sheriff looked between Hartwell and the mob, calculating his survival. Then a horse thundered into the square. The territorial marshal had arrived. Fama had sent him a telegram days ago, insurance against this moment. I'll be conducting a search of Mr. Hartwell's property, the marshal announced. Now, they found James locked in Hartwell's cellar, beaten but alive. They also found ledgers documenting every crime, every payoff, every murder. Hartwell tried to run, but was caught at the county line. As they dragged him away in chains, he screamed at Fama. You've won nothing. That land will destroy you. Fama met his eyes steadily. No, we'll heal it. Together. James recovered slowly, his body battered, but his spirit unbroken. The legal battles took months, but eventually the land was theirs free and clear. The deed was put in both their names, equal partners. They opened the spring to the valley farmers, charging fair rates that helped everyone survive the drought. Fama's father tried to reconcile, but she wasn't ready. Maybe someday, she told him, if you stay sober and treat my sisters with respect. Her sisters visited often, delighted to see Fama truly happy. You're different, Emma said. Stronger. I learned I was always strong, Fama replied. I just needed someone who believed it. 6 months after Hartwell's arrest, they held a real wedding. By the spring, surrounded by community and wildflowers. This time Fama wore a dress she'd made herself. This time her vows were chosen freely. I was forced to say I do once, she told James. Today I choose it. I choose you. I choose us. That night, alone in their cabin, Fama revealed her secret. I'm pregnant. James's joy was tinged with fear, memories of losing Sarah and Daniel still fresh. But Fama took his hands and placed them on her belly. We're not them. We're us. And whatever comes, we face it together. Together, James agreed and kissed her like a promise. At 19, she'd been sold to a stranger. But that stranger had done something unexpected. He'd given her freedom. He'd waited for her choice. He'd protected her and believed in her and built a life with her one day at a time. The spring flowed freely now, giving life to the whole valley. In the cabin where grief had once lived alone, there was laughter again. There was love. There was a future being built together. Fama stood at the window one morning, James's arms around her, his hands on her growing belly. "Thank you for waiting for me," she whispered. "Thank you for choosing me," he replied. And in that moment, everything that had been forced became free. Everything that had been broken became whole.